In this presentation I'm going to be talking about the telecommunications arrangement that were operating within Australia in 2001. At that stage I had just left the Australian Communications Authority, ACA, and had picked up a contract with Air Services Australia to make presentations to telecommunications personnel within Air Services Australia of how the arrangements were operating within Australia. So to help me make this presentation, I put together this block diagram. Now the block diagram refers to ASNZS 3260, which is a safety standard. It has since been replaced by a IEC standard IEC 62368-1 and 2018, and it's been called up by the ACMA technical standard 2018. Anyway, the arrangements were that the technical standard 1 in those days picked up ASNZS 3260, and it was to make sure that anyone who made equipment for connection to telecommunications network made it so that it was safe for the user and for the network operator. Now, the arrangements were that we had the carriers defined as being the supplier of the services to the customer. The carriers were Telstra, Optus and Vodafone. Not all of the carriers provided all the services, although Telstra certainly provided most of them. So Telstra were the carriers. There was a network boundary set up in two areas, one here at the building entry point, and the main network boundary, which is the one when the customer can actually connect their equipment to the telecommunications network, was within usually the customer's premises, or certainly within within the boundary of the property, and usually within the house or on the wall of the house. So I referred to that as being a carrier island, where they had responsibility to make sure that when they provided a service to the customer, that the customer equipment that was going to be connecting to it was going to be safe, and also had interoperability requirements, which is what they mainly needed. There were different networks. The first one usually was the public switch telephone network, PSTN, an analog network. So the network equipment was in here, the directly connected equipment is here, and there's even a further connection within the house, for instance, for the public switch telephone network, which had the outlets within the building separated from the customer, that the plain old telephone or the fax or modem had to plug in to the wall outlets. Anyway, any of the equipment that was connecting to their network had to comply with the safety standard ASNZS 3260, and that of course has been replaced by the IEC standard, as I mentioned. Now there is also within the customer's premises this customer equipment, but there's also other equipment that can connect to the equipment within the customer's premises, and that equipment might not have to meet the customer equipment technical standard, but meet other standards, so it would have to provide a separate interface. Okay, so the public switch telephone network, the integrated services digital network, the other networks um, had the requirements for providing um, interface equipment. Now, in this case, the public switch telephone network digital was using customer line termination equipment. So there's the customer line termination equipment that still provided a TNV output to the customer equipment, because that output had not necessarily the network voltages. I'll just go through those, by the way. There's a number of different voltages and that had to be isolated from the customer and the customer equipment. The customer So for instance, on the public switch telephone network, the analog network, which was just the ordinary paired cable that would come into your house that your ordinary plain old telephone would plug into, had voltages on the line such as the voltage, DC voltage, to be able to drive the customer equipment, and which was up to 50 volts. It also had ringtone, and the ringtone could be in the order of 90 volts AC or something like that. So they were considered to be voltages that you don't really need to touch. So they were telecommunications network voltages. But there's also the possibility of other voltages on there, such as lightning, induced lightning voltages that would come from lightning hitting the ground or hitting poles near the actual wires and inducing voltages into the conductors, and they needed to be absorbed or reduced before they got to the customer equipment or within the customer equipment. But there's also induced voltages from mains powered lines, or even during a fault on mains lines, there could be other voltages induced into these cable pairs, and not be the sort of stuff that we'd want to touch. So they're called telecommunications network voltages. Now for us, when we're using, say, coming out of a modem and going to plug into our computer, we wanted the voltages to be such that they were safe for us to use. That you might consider as being something like the equivalent of something coming out of a plug pack. It's not a pair of wires you want to hang on to, but it's a pair of wires that if you did hang on to, it's not going to cause you too much damage. And you certainly wouldn't want to put the conductors in your mouth, as you wouldn't want to do that with the output of a plug pack either. So they're called safety extra low voltages, and they're ones that people can use safely. Now, the ordinary old telephone is a standalone isolated unit, doesn't have any connections to it usually, and just the handset. Now, most of the insulation is provided by the plastic or other materials that are that the plain old phone is housed in. A fax machine is a standalone machine, so any metallic parts are going to be isolated, insulated from the telecommunications network voltages. And that goes for any of the equipment plugging into the PSTN. Also, PABXs, or private automatic branch exchanges, also can connect to the public switch telephone network, and a lot of this equipment, by the way, is dying out now, and the paired equipment coming in from the network is still going to be here, but it's going to be plugging into network termination units or customer line terminal units to be able to provide the isolation before it connects into other equipment. So the whole idea with any equipment that's connected to the telecommunications network is that the voltages that were operating on the network, that's the ring, the DC, the induced voltages, lightning strikes and all that, is going to be either isolated by the carrier, or else we'll have an interface on it that will be providing isolation before we connect the equipment to the customer's other equipment. So the idea of connecting a modem or a computer to a modem, or and in the case now where we're using set-top boxes and such as DSL or ASDL type services, they're going to provide an isolation that's able to be connected to, allowing connection to the customer equipment. I'm not going to go too much further with the little description about the telecommunications network that was operating back in 2001, but it goes to say, I guess what I'm saying is that there are a lot of different types of equipment that can connect to the telecommunications network, Telstra, Optus and Vodafone. A lot of them now are air interface and therefore provide different requirements. So a lot of that is covered under uh, other technical standards for interoperability, and safety still is an issue, and the equipment still has to comply with the safety standards. There's a lot of information on here, such as these numbers there down the side here in blue, that are categories of numbers that are under Schedule 1 of the Telecommunications labelling notice. Those numbers are these B29 for instance, or A1s, they don't are not covered by or the labelling notice doesn't refer to those numbers anymore. They've got a different set of numbers. So you'd have to look up the Telecommunications Labelling Notice 2018 at the moment. So you have to get the latest information to work out what the latest requirements are. A lot of this equipment is probably redundant now. They're no longer selling, or the carriers are no longer providing that type of service, or else you can't buy or are not allowed to connect that type of customer equipment to the network anymore. But it's interesting to keep in mind that there is a carrier's network, that you do have to connect customer equipment to that network, and the customer equipment does have to comply with the appropriate standards that are called up in the telecommunications labelling notice that is in force at the time, and that it was a complicated message to get across in the first place, but having a block diagram like this I found was interesting, and also an aid for me to try and show the big picture to those people who I was trying to give an insight into what was happening within Australia's telecommunications network at the time. Thank you.